Pro Tour Thunder Junction is in the books, baby. Congratulations, first of all, to Ikawa. First place, piloting Domain Ramp, a deck that was less than 7% of the field going into this weekend. And we'll get to how we got there, but there's a ton of stories to tell on the way, because in my 29 years of playing Magic the Gathering, this is one of the best Pro Tours I've ever seen.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
Pro Tour Yeehaw review time, everybody, and it was both a barn burner and a slobber knocker, if you can believe it. Lots of entertaining threads throughout this weekend, and big ups to the commentary team and everyone behind the cameras. Just bang up job by the entire production unit on this one. Everything looked slick, everything sounded nice. It was a good little event in terms of presentation, but honestly, the real story here is the level of play that was on display at this event, especially amongst this group of top 8 competitors that we ended up with. But with that in mind, I actually want to start by briefly looking at the top 16 and telling some of those stories from over the weekend. But I'm actually kind of fibbing, because the first thing I want to look at from today is the breakout deck of the tournament, and it barely didn't make top 16. 18th place, again, just grazing the top 16 for Kevin Anktil was Orzhov Costic Bronco, or Bronco combo, as people are saying. And this was 10-5-1 over the weekend, which is still a very, very good record. And it's probably the coolest, newest deck at the tournament. In case you haven't seen this yet, the big cards in here are both brand new cards from Thunder Junction. Costic Bronco, 2 mana, 1 and a black for a 2/2 Snake Horse mount that saddles for 3. It's kind of like crewing a vehicle. Whenever it attacks, not combat damage, whenever it attacks, reveal the top card of your library, put it into your hand. You lose life equal to that card's mana value if Bronco isn't saddled. If it is saddled, each opponent's going to lose that much life instead. So the idea here is to use Insatiable Avarice, another brand new card from Thunder Junction, for a total of 3 mana. You'll search your library for a card, shuffle, put the card on top. So a Vampiric Tutor or something like that. And what you're going to be doing is putting a Shadow of Mortality on top of your library. This card costs 15 mana, and other than that, the text doesn't really matter that much, but it's a 7/7. If your life total is less than your starting life total, spell costs X less to cast. X is that difference. So, okay, we get down to a few life. It's a 7/7, whatever. But what we're really hoping to do is hit our opponent for 15 damage. We're going to cast Insatiable Avarice on 3. After we cast Costic Bronco on 2, so curve these cards into one another, attack with Bronco on turn 3, and hit our opponent for a minimum 15 damage, not counting Costic Bronco's attack if it actually goes through for damage. So that is a wacky combo right there, and it doesn't have to strike on turn 3. There's other ways of setting it up. You've got things like Steel Seraph in here, which can give Bronco flying to make sure it continues to get in for actual damage and continue attacking. Vigilance is still very, very good against Wandering Emperor and stuff. Lifelink good against aggro decks, obviously. It's very hard to kill this card. Doesn't die to cut down or go for the throat. That's super important, especially in this particular Pro Tour meta where Esper is so strong. Anointed Peacekeeper is here too. This can crew, I say crew, it can saddle up on the Bronco and also keep your opponent from casting key cards that would interact with you, or the Sunfall or whatever. 4 Sheldreds in here. It's just good to get this off the top of your library. It's worth 4 damage to your opponent. You play it, you can actually play the card. So that's pretty good. And just take over the game that way, deal that last few points of damage to the opponent if you did end up hitting them with the combo in the early game. And since they've used a lot of their resources interacting with the combo, they won't have the resources to interact with Sheldred theoretically, so there's that. You've also got Scrub to protect the Costic Bronco and make sure it gets through for damage and can continue doing its thing, protected from removal. Shrouded Shepherd, these are the next couple of cards, are very interesting picks. Shrouded Shepherd, mostly against aggro, just bodies Boros and some mono red piles and add tokens piles and stuff. So really, really good sort of adventure mode on this thing. But you can also play it, give itself +2/+2, and then crew the Bronco. Again, saddle the Bronco. Rafine's Informant, this is an interesting pick too. This can get you a card deeper into your deck. So we're kind of a combo deck. We care about that. It can draw the Shadow of Mortality if you wanted to. It can just draw whatever you put on top of your library with Insatiable Avarice more likely. And if it gets to, 3 power, then it can then saddle up on the Bronco too. So that's important. Tenacious Underdog can be dropped into the yard with Rafine's Informant, but it also saddles the Bronco. Good long game card. And Shadow, we've already talked about. As far as the removal package here, which is really what the spells are, 3 cut down and 3 go for the throat. Pretty simple. 3 throw goat, 3 cutters. So That's a pretty easy, reliable removal package. You got 24 lands in this deck. Take a huge advantage of the new Concealed Courtyard. It's not new, it's reprinted, but you know what I mean. And then in the sideboard, we've got Aven Interrupter to make sure that we can interrupt, appropriately enough, our opponent's game plan, trying to sort of interact with us. Pest Control, take out Boros and stuff like that. Duress against control decks. Touch the Spirit Realm as a removal piece that can also protect Bronco some of the time. Rest in Peace, because we don't care about our graveyard, and a lot of other decks do. Gutsel's Flanker as a tempo piece. Knockout Blow against aggro. Another fourth cut down against aggro. Invasion of Gobekon and such against mostly control decks, but the odd Esper deck or whatever too. So just a really well-constructed Orzhov deck. Of course, my favorite deck of the weekend is Orzhov, if you know anything about me, but this is undeniably a really, really sweet game plan to be on. I've seen some Costic Bronco decks on Arena be sort of demure, protect their guys with shore-ups and stuff like that, but this is just a really, really interesting way of going about it, and going 10-5 against a field full of hostile Esper decks and stuff is actually a pretty good record for this brand new deck over its first weekend in Standard, so I wanted to bring it up. But here we are in the top 16. I want to take a brief look at some of these competitors and their decks before we get to the top 8. I think it's important, not only because all these people work their butts off to get to where they are in this tournament, but also because there's some cool stories here, and especially there's one deck that is the jankiest, most unexpected deck of the entire tournament, and you could argue had the second best record over the whole weekend, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's first talk about Shota Yasaoka over here. Can you guess what deck Shota was playing? If you know anything about Shota, you know he's always on Azorius control, or some form of control or another. Maybe one of the most celebrated and well-known control players of all time. And again, just perfectionist play from Shota over the weekend. One of the only two players in the whole event to make the top 16 with Azorius control. It required brilliant play over the weekend to overcome all of the decks that are predatory against control that were in this tournament, most notably decks like 4-color Legends, but you even have a very tight matchup with Esper Midrange a lot of the time, and that's the most played deck at the tournament. So again, required master level play to enter the top 16 with a deck like Azorius control, especially in a relatively young format. Like OTJ, the control hasn't had a whole lot of time to respond to just yet. So again, hats off to Shota. If you know anything about this weekend, you know that the other player on Azorius control was in the finals. So again, required incredible levels of play to get to this level with Azorius control in this tournament. And Shota is nothing if not incredible every time he plays control, which is basically every time he shuffles a deck of Magic cards. Now, next you see is Andrew Kidston with Jund Analyst, but I'm going to skip that for just a second. We'll get right back to it because it's awesome. Instead, first, I want to talk about the 4 Esper midrange decks in the top 16, and mostly that's what I want to talk about, is how many there are in the top 16 as opposed to the top 8. We expected a lot of Esper midrange in the top 16 at large because there's so many Esper midrange decks in the tournament. It just makes statistical sense, right? However, there's only 2 Esper midrange decks in the top 8, where, again, statistically, you would think there would be more than that. But instead, a lot of, these Esper midrange decks, or at least the ones that were piloted the best, ended up here in the top 16 in this sort of glut of competitors, right? Carl Sarup, Adam Edelson, Massa, and even perennial Pro Tour player Javier Dominguez over here. Been playing for a very, very, very long time. All on Esper midrange and all falling within the top 16. It's also Nicole Tipple, one of the stories of the weekend that a lot of people were following, and for good reason. She is a first-time Pro Tour competitor and ended up in the top 16, grazing the top 8. Very good record of 11-5 with 4-color Legends, and this is the first 4-color Legends deck that we'll have a look at today. This is pretty much the list that a lot of people were on this weekend, but there were some changes here and there to different lists. You can tell why I like this list if you've already seen the Ellis Hill core that's in here. Now, there are multiple ways of making a sort of infinite loop with Honest Rutstein, Rona, and Relic of Legends. We've talked about it a couple of times, but just in case you've never seen it before, you have a Relic of Legends in play, which taps for mana and allows you to untap legendary dudes you control to add mana. So Rona untaps whenever you cast a legendary spell. That means you tap her for mana, cast a legendary spell, untap her. Honest Rutstein, this makes all your creatures cost 1 less to cast. And when it ETBs, you return a creature card from your yard to your hand. Those are all the pieces in place. So basically, You want 2 copies of Honest Rutstein, copy of Rona, copy of Relic of Legends. This deck is almost never going to actually win with this infinite loop, but it's nice to have it in play. It's nice to have it as a possibility. I didn't see any on-camera wins with the Infinite, but again, it's important to know about it. So basically, you have 2 Honest Rutsteins legend ruling themselves over and over, right? One gets the other back from the graveyard. It only costs 2 mana to play because of Rutstein's passive ability. You tap down the untapped Rutstein and a Rona to cast it with the Relic of Legends. You cast that second Rona, you legend rule the tapped one into the yard, then this ETB trigger gets that one out of the yard that just went there because of the legend rule, and then you cast it with Rona and Honest Rutstein on the table, and then, right, you just legend rule them over and over, and you loop them, and eventually you can do crazy stuff. If you have an Ellis-Ilkor Sadistic Pilgrim in play, then you're doing 1 damage every time the Honest Rutstein comes into play, so you're just killing them. You're going to kill them that way, basically. But Ellis-Ilkor is also, if you know anything about the channel, my wife, I have a wife, right? That's why I wear this ring, but also we have an understanding. Ellis-Ilkor, we're getting married. The joke never gets old, but in any case, this is just a solid creature. A 2 mana death touch is going to block and kill an awful lot of stuff in the format, and obviously a lot of your creatures have lightning rods on them, so you might get incidental drains out of this. And also you gain life when creatures come into play, so that's infinite life, infinite damage, all good. But the deck is mostly going to actually win using Slogurk the Overslime loops. This is a fairly old card that's actually going to rotate soon, and that's kind of lame because it's finally getting its due. This card's always been awesome the whole time it's been in Standard, but it's especially good with channel lands. Whenever Slogurk leaves the battlefield, you return 3 lands from your graveyard to your hand, right? So if you have all these legends in play, it only costs like 1 mana to channel any of these legendary lands because they all care about how many legendaries you have in play. They cost less depending on how many you have. So basically you'll be channeling just about any channel land for a single mana. And then when Slogurk leaves the battlefield, which you can force to happen, by the way, by removing 3 counters from it, then you'll get all your legendary lands back. And this will lead to loops where you can Atawara everything off of the table. You can Takenuma a bunch of stuff back from your graveyard to get the exact cards you're looking for, right? You can Besage you all away their important permanents and even lands and stuff like that. So just an absolutely nasty deck. Very often you'll even see, I don't see it in this version, but very often you'll even see Sakenzan, the red channel land, to basically just fill your side of the board with dudes and attack because they all have haste. So Slogurk loops are the sort of bread and butter of this deck, but one of the other great, amazing, basically the other best card in the deck is Inti Seneschal of the Sun. This for 2 mana is a 2/2, and whenever you attack, you get to discard a card. Put a counter on attacking creature, and it gains trample till end of turn, and whenever you discard a card, exile the top card of your library. You can play that card till your next end step. Now, you will get attacks triggers on this sometimes and make your creatures a little bit bigger, and that's all good and well, but basically the idea here is that whenever you channel a land, that'll proc the discard trigger part of this card, and you'll get to draw cards effectively with NT, and you'll probably have a bunch of mana too, thanks to Relic, and the fact that you have 28 lands and 29 lands in your deck or whatever. So again, you'll have a lot of mana in play to do all these things. So with a Relic in play, you especially get a ridiculous amount of mana, and you can just start kind of drawing your deck with Inti, which is disgusting, right? Also, Rona makes you discard cards whenever you tap her, draw a card, discard a card. So a loot on the tap ability, untap her when legendaries come into play. So you get a lot of activations of this card. Comboing it with Inti is ridiculous because you'll get to see like 7 cards over the course of, a mid-game turn when you're not even all the way set up yet. So you can keep these pieces in place with Honest Rutstein. That's the quote-unquote honest use of this card in the deck, is to just make sure you keep your Slogurks, your Intis, your Ronas, your Titanias, because Titania also gains you 2 life whenever a land goes to the graveyard from anywhere. So, if you're milling stuff with Takenuma and lands go into your yard, if you're discarding lands to channel, then you just gain a bunch of life and can really help you restabilize. Also blocks Deep Cavern Bats and Sirens or Spyglass Sirens and stuff. Urtai Resurrected, ridiculous interactive legend here that can basically just counter important plays. Aklazats, we saw this on camera over the weekend carry a few players in multiple decks, whether it was Esper or 4-color legends. To victory, and usually you just see like the one of Silver Bullet hanging out Aklazats, but again, this can do a ton of work. Of course, Ellis Core, again, this in the deck to enable infinite loops and just be solid. And then Tiny Bones the Pickpocket, just a 1-mana legend that can just turn the game around in the late game. Again, if you can, sort of a Tower of this, a Tower of that off the board and get it through for a clear shot. It's ridiculous what you can pickpocket with this card some of the time. Relic of Legends is sort of the thing that makes the deck tick almost more than any other card, but Slogurk, again, is the real MVP here. And then some removal like Go for the Throat and Cut Down. The deck, again, plays 29 lands. That's because it's got, 11 spells within its lands. So its mana base contains a lot of the most important spells in the deck between Otaru, Takenuma, Boseiju. Very often in sideboard, you'll see a Jace. I don't know if she's on it. She is not, but very often... Oh, no, she is. There's Jace the Perfected Mind. Jace is in there mostly to mill your opponent out a million times because you Jace minus whatever to get it off the table. They mill a bunch. And then you Takenuma to get the Jace back. The Takenuma only costs 1 mana. You get the Jace back, play it again, mill them out. And just, if you have enough mana and enough turns, and sometimes it only takes 1 turn, you just kill them that way. So this deck picks on control pretty hard and has a decent matchup, a more than decent matchup, actually. I believe it's supposed to be favorable against Esper. So it was a very, very good pick over the weekend. Esper often plays kind of like a tempo-y sort of control deck, so if this deck can get into the later game against Esper, then often it can really do a lot of damage. The theory is that the later the game goes, the better a deck is, a deck like this is, against decks like Esper and Azorius control and such, and that mostly played out over the weekend. We got to see a lot of feature matchups with 4 and even 5 color legends played by like Brian Kibler and such, so a lot of action from decks like this over the weekend. And even though no one was built exactly the same, the core tenet is usually the same. So Slogurk is a busted card, is kind of the principle of the deck, and channel lands are busted. So this deck is almost completely null and void upon rotation when all of these cards, not all, but most of these very important cards in the deck are going to rotate. So play it while you can. It sucks that we only really get 1.5 seasons with this deck being like one of the top dogs, because it's been great for a while. And congrats again to Nicole Tipple, just first Pro Tour ever, and you come out with 11th place, 11-5 with like a brand new deck that I don't even know how much time she had to test this thing against, the gauntlet or anything. So it really, really great showing for a first-time Pro Tour competitor. But let's look next at Andrew Kidston's Jund Analyst deck. Now, this is a spicy Analyst deck that does not look anything like most of the decks that you've seen that play, World Souls Rage and Aftermath Analyst. I mean, the core is the same. Here you've got your World Souls Rage, deals a bunch of damage, brings a bunch of lands back from the graveyard at the same time. You've got your Aftermath Analyst in the deck. It's basically a Splendid Reclamation on legs. You've got 4 Splendid Reclamations in the deck too. Why not, kid? You've got 4 Nissa, Resurgent Animus, the 3-mana Nissa that landfalls and gets you mana and also finds elves and stuff if it's the second time a land is coming to play. So really, really cool. Really, really cool package here for ramping. We've seen that along with the new Capenna lands in the mana base, the ones that sacrifice when they enter play, they gain you a life, and then you go get a corresponding, basic land type. Together, that shell has been amazing for getting you into the late game, first of all, because you gain all that life, and then when you Aftermath Analyst or Splendid Reclamation, you gain a bunch of life again, right? So this basic core has been great in a sort of Temur Analyst build with sweepers and some interactive elements, right? But instead here, we're doing something a little bit different. Now, we're still playing the Spelunking. This deck is on Spelunking lately because, the new Capenna lands will bring the basics into play untapped, if that made any sense. The basics from the new Capenna lands will come into play untapped, and that's awesome. But 3 new cards. First of all, Gix's Command is kind of our sweeper in this deck that can also bring back Nissas and Aftermath Analyst and Shigekis and such against control in longer games and stuff like that. So a sweeper that has a little bit more flexibility than a card like Ill-Timed Explosion. Even though Ill-Timed Explosion still draws you 2 cards and sometimes doesn't do anything else. Like it can sometimes at least draw you 2. This doesn't do that, but again, some increased flexibility against certain decks in the field that I think it's important to have. But the exciting cards are, first, Pillage the Bog. Look at the top X cards of your library. X is twice the number of lands you control. You get 1 of them into your hand, the rest on the bottom in a random order. You can plot it for 3 mana. So in this deck, we're going to be looking at 15 cards, like a lot of the time. Like a modest Pillage the Bog is going to look at 7 or 8 cards fairly easily. So really, really sick thing. We're not playing blue, so we don't get memory deluge. So this is basically our memory deluge in this deck, and it's just a really, really neat call to play this thing. Again, later on in the game, you're going to be looking at like 12 cards fairly easily with the Pillage the Bog. You will find the World Soul's Rage, or the Reclamation, or the Shigeki, or the whatever, the Analyst that you're looking for. You will find the Droid, no matter which one it is you're looking for. But Pitiless Carnage is even more interesting in this thing. This is 4 mana for a sorcery. Sack any number of permanents you control. Draw that many cards. You can also plot this for 3 mana, 1 and 2 black. So you're mostly going to be sacking lands to this, right? But you've seen Analyst, like in the late game, you've got, I don't know, again, like 16 lands. But even again, a modest Pitiless Carnage hit is going to put, 5 lands into the graveyard. Now, especially with Spelunking in play, this combo is really interestingly, because you can put a bunch of lands into play untapped with, a World Soul's Rage, say, or an Aftermath Analyst getting a bunch of cards out of your graveyard. You get all the new Capenna lands. They put a bunch of untapped lands into play because of Spelunking. You can then tap all of those untapped lands and cast Pitiless Carnage, right? And then sack like nearly all of your lands. It doesn't matter. You can literally sacrifice like 12 lands to this thing, and it doesn't matter. You've got a bunch of mana, and that means when you draw a Splendid Wreck, or you draw an Aftermath Analyst, you just get to put all those lands you sacrifice right back into play and keep going. But in the meantime, you drew like 10 cards. So you're guaranteed to find World Soul's Rage or whatever it is that you need to kind of put the game away. This deck doesn't even bother to play like the green Virtue or anything. It feels like it doesn't need to do that. So just an absolutely nutty pile right here. And the interesting thing about this, before we get off of it, is that it went 10, 3, and 3 over the weekend. Now, that is a fair number of draws, don't get me wrong, but you could also make the argument that this deck has fewer losses than any deck in the entire tournament, except for the deck that won the tournament. The winning deck only had 1 loss over the entire weekend, and that is quite the achievement, by the way, for Ikawa. But you could also make the argument this deck only had 3 actual losses over the weekend, putting it sort of in second place in terms of decks that had the most or the least losses. So that is quite the achievement when you really think about it. It's a little bit mind-bending that this deck had fewer losses than any deck above it in the entire tournament. Save again for the winning deck. So very, very cool stuff over here. So really wanted to bring this deck to your attention. The fact that it got all the way up here into the top 16 is not necessarily a miracle. It might just be because the deck is really well positioned. Who doesn't want to draw like 15 cards, right? Just really, really cool pile. The other top 16 competitor was Etienne Eggenschweiler with their 4-color Legends build, which is pretty similar to a lot of the other 4-color Legends builds that we've been seeing. One of the big differences between this and the last one that we saw was that they ended up playing a card that would become popular as we get into the top 8 in these 4-color Legends decks, and that's Vial Smasher. Now, a lot had been said at the beginning of the format, the beginning of the season here, about how to best take advantage of the infinite combo that's inherent to this deck. That's just kind of plugged into it. And my bet was on Tiny Bones Joins Up because you're playing so many Legends and all that. Some people played Annie Joins Up to double up triggers and get like infinite mana, and also just like incidental extra triggers off of like Titania and stuff like that, where you get like 1 billion life. So not a bad call either. That's mostly what we've seen so far on MTGO results as Annie Joins Up. But this was the first time, this tournament was the first time I'd seen Vial Smasher used so often. It makes perfect sense. Whenever an outlaw enters the battlefield under your control, deals damage to target opponent. Well, on its Rutstein, that's an outlaw. So, if you've got the loop going, then this is infinite damage. But again, only 1 copy of this, just like the Yellow Soul Core, and that will remain the case as we go through these 4-color Legends decks. So keep that in mind. If you want to see a cool, matchup between 4-color Legends and 5-color Legends, and they're both very, very different decks, by the way, then check it out. There's a feature matchup between Etienne and Brian Kibler that I found really, really entertaining on the second day of coverage. So really cool matchup there. Again, if you want to see this deck in action, that's a good one to watch. But moving into the top 8, we have perennial online competitor Sean Goddard with a big top 8 here in an actual Pro Tour, huge event for Sean Goddard this time around. with a Temur Analyst, and the only Temur Analyst player, by the way, in the top 8. And I believe the top 16, Jund Analyst was the other Analyst deck in the top 16. So really good performance. And Analyst honestly kind of had a breakout performance over the weekend. Not too many people expected it to be such a large-ish chunk of the meta. I mean, obviously Esper had the largest chunk. But in terms of other decks that had chunks of the meta going in here, Analyst was a surprisingly large one. So how did, Sean end up building this pile? Well, we've got obviously the core, 4 Aftermath Analysts, 4 Nissa in this deck, a Shigeki, which I didn't talk too much about in the last build, but obviously very important card in a deck like this. You've got all the mana in the world so you can channel and get back, the Aftermath Analyst, the Ill-Timed Explosions, the World Souls Rages, the Memory Deluges if you want to, the Spelunkings if you need them, right? Lands if you need them to. So Shigeki, unbelievably good card. And very often you'll see like one Sky Turtle or one other way of getting it back from your graveyard. Here we have 4 Virtue of Strength, which can just get the Shigeki back from your graveyard. You can kind of loop these indefinitely if you need to. So that's kind of nice. But Virtue is also capable of getting back a lot of stuff. This first mode on the card is really underrated. I don't see a lot of people talking about it, but in a lot of decks Virtue is in, especially the Analyst decks. Being able to just like 1 mana get back an Analyst, 1 mana get back a Nissa is great. That's really good like regrowth ability, right? But obviously the broken ability on this is the ability to triple tap basic lands for mana. Which is crazy for just making sure that you can actually hit that World Souls for enough damage to kill your opponent. So you got Memory Delusion here. It's kind of what I was saying in the last deck we looked at. We played Pillage the Bog in that one, but traditionally you play all 4. Memory Deluge, just incredible card. And another one that is leaving when we get rotation, so keep that in mind. I don't know how long this deck's going to be around, but we will still have World Souls Rage in the format. We will still have, Aftermath Analyst in the format. So the basic shell, we will still have Nissa too. So the basic shell's there. We just won't have the new Capenna lands. And a couple of other kind of important cards. We'll see how well that affects or how much that affects the deck. But I think it's still got a shot. I do. We still got Virtue, we're still doing stuff. So, I don't know. We got all those deserts now that deal a damage when they come into play. So it's possible that those are sort of what the deck shifts to once we get rotation. But still, again, just wonderful, wonderful performance by Sean. And it is a fairly, standard version of the deck. This one playing Fires of Victory over a card like Vampire's Vengeance in the main. But we do have Vampire's Vengeance in the sideboard. So do take note of that, right? Also, Colossal Sky Turtle. There it is in the sideboard. Titan of Industry is a card that I saw come in a lot of games in game 2 and 3 against especially decks like Esper and such. Doppelgang. Really interesting card to have in here. This does enable some pretty big plays, but you got to be going pretty deep into the game. So again, against decks where you do that, this seems pretty interesting to play. And then Bonnie Paul, you'll sometimes see this in the main deck, but instead of the 1 in the main deck, we're going 2 in the sideboard. This is another great creature to bring in if the game's going to go a little midi or a little longish, So I really do like Bonnie, and I'm surprised to see the 2 of in the board. I've been seeing a lot of 1-ofs in the main, but again, against this particular field, I can understand why you'd want to sort of cut that and put them in the board. But really cool performance here. Good to see at least 1 Analyst deck, but not too many Analyst decks in the top 8. I think that's important. Now, we had 2 players on 4-color Legends in the top 8. That's just as many players as were on Esper Midrange in the top 8. I find that fascinating. We had Jason Yee and CFT Sock, or Ray Zong, but most people know this brewer as CFT Sock, a celebrated online brewer that actually brought 4-color Legends into the limelight earlier in the last season in MKM Standard with a huge win in Chicago. We covered that and got an ungodly amount of views, so you might remember that one. But how has 4-color Legends evolved since CFT Sock last brought it to a large event? Well, here we are with, again, what would appear to be a fairly stock build of the deck, but there are some interesting calls in here, especially the 2 copies of the Goose Mothered. This one, you'll have so much mana in the late game that this is a really, really interesting play, and it's going to create a bunch of food tokens which can keep you in the game too. Whenever it attacks, you can draw cards off the food and all that. So this is just an interesting sort of other dimension to have in the deck if your other plans don't come together. An interesting mana sink to have for all that mana on turns where you would otherwise draw dead or whatever. And if it sits in your hand for a few turns, that's kind of fine. You're doing other cool stuff you'd rather do. But again, if that game plan ever dries up or falls through, opponent deals with slow Gurk loops, or they, get rid of your graveyard somehow so you can't get back, or they rest in peace so you can't do anything with your channel lands, whatever. Then Goose Mother is a very interesting alternate plan to just fly over for like 13 damage, like fairly easily. And in the meantime, get a bunch of little artifact tokens too, if you care about those. Just leave it to CFT to make some sort of innovation every time, especially when it comes to figuring out what the meta is going to be. I actually really like this as a call against, say, Esper. If you're going to go late, then why not blow them out with something that's going to get way bigger than their Rafine can ever dream of getting. It gets bigger than even a Duelist of the Mind can get. Or Fairy Mastermind, just all of their little flyers and stuff, even the ones that can grow, considerably. They can put, 4 counters on a Deep Cavern Bat with connive triggers from a Rafine or whatever, and Goose Mother is still going to stop all that dead in its tracks. Really interesting sort of line. Again, I just have to praise the Goose Mother being in this deck. But aside from that, even the board and all the land choices look fairly similar to what we've been seeing. I note that I do want to point out the Xander's Lounge in here. Very often these decks will not include this card, but maybe it's because of stuff like Vile Smasher and whatnot that you have to make concessions like Xander's Lounge in this deck. But really, the big technology is the Goose Mother, and I thought that was an amazing addition to this deck. Now, Lucas Duchow and Arna Huschenbeth here celebrated Pro Tour player Arna Huschenbeth. Both on Esper, but both on very sort of different decks, if you don't mind me sort of bringing up the differences between these two, because I think it's really interesting. Esper gets this bad rap for being a very sort of homogenous deck. It's taken over standard and it's boring and it's been around for too long. But actually, there is a lot of play in how you build this deck, and that's the real game with Esper, is that no two Esper decks are exactly the same, and these two Esper decks are vastly different. We see one copy of the Wandering Emperor in Lucas's build, 4 Deep Cavern Bat, 4 Rafine. These things are similar in both decks. 3 Fairy Mastermind, a card the other deck plays as well. 2 Dinnik, again, a card the other deck plays. Aclazotz, whatever. But this deck is going to play 3 copies of Duelist of the Mind, which Arna's deck does not play any copies of in the main deck. We saw a lot of this over the weekend, where Duelist of the Mind is a great sort of 2-mana play to curve into Rafine, especially if you don't get your Deep Cavern Bat. Duelist is incredible. And sometimes even if you do get your Deep Cavern Bat, you want to sort of sequence things where you get Deep Cavern on 4 after Duelist on 3 or 2 into Rafine on 3, get some damage in. Deep Cavern Bat shut down the Sunfall, right? So there's lines where you do play Duelist on 2. This deck also plays Preacher of the Schism, a card that didn't see all the play over the weekend, but some Esper players ended up on it. Here we see Lucas in the top 8 with 3 copies of Preacher, so it's not like it was the wrong call over the weekend. We just didn't see as many players on it as I maybe would have expected. They were using slots in different ways. We also have Tishana's Tidebinder in here. We saw this card used a ton of different ways over the weekend, from shutting down Atraxa triggers and all the way down to little stuff that you wouldn't normally expect, like Tidebinder, your incubator thing, so your Sunfall incubator trigger. So just really, really interesting stuff. Again, in terms of how this deck is built. Now, the instant package, Go for the Throat, No More Lies, Cut Down, you'll see that an awful lot. The removal packages don't often change, although sometimes you'll see things like Destroy Evil or even March of Otherworldly Light in these builds, although not super often. Looking at Arna's build, 2 Wandering Emperor instead of just 1. The creatures are a little bit lighter. Again, no Duelist or anything like that. But we are playing the Aclazotz, 3 Dinnik instead of 2. I guess I flubbed that, but still 4 Rafine, and then 3 Fairy Mastermind, which, Lucas was also playing Fairy Mastermind. Most Esper decks are on 2 or 3. Just really great showing over the weekend for this card. Just fan-freaking-tastic. It's just amazing card Mastermind is, because everyone's drawing cards. So there are a lot of situations on camera where, the player with Fairy Mastermind would be drawing 3 cards a turn to the other player's 1 because they had this thing in play. It's just ridiculous. But wedding announcement in this deck. No wedding announcement in Lucas's deck. Now, I want to say that on Channel Fireball, and if I remember to link it, I will in the description. But on Channel Fireball, in late October, Arna already did a write-up of Esper Control, or Esper midrange. And in it, now, obviously, a couple of sets have come out since then, but it's still not outdated. I really highly recommend this article. I believe it's called something about this deck solves standard, or standard is solved thanks to this deck, and it's about Esper. Brilliant write-up about Esper from a brilliant player. And in it, he says that Wedding Announcement is basically non-negotiable. The 3 drops are Rafine, Wedding Announcement, and apart from that, you can start negotiating 3 drops, but Wedding Announcement, again, non-negotiable. Absolutely must play 3 drop. So interesting that he's on it, where a lot of players at the tournament were not. Same thing with Virtue. He talks a little bit about, in that article, that same article, about the importance of Esper being able to sort of grind with cards like Wedding Announcement and Virtue of Loyalty. And we didn't see any Virtues in Lucas's deck. And the deck that ended up doing slightly better for what it's worth at the tournament ended up with 4 Wedding Announcements, which Lucas didn't play, 3 Virtues, which Lucas didn't play, no Duelists, which Lucas did play. So, again, just very different decks. And I'm not calling one any better than the other. I'm just saying, again, if Esper's getting a bad rap for being a homogenous deck, I'm just trying to prove the point that it's kind of not, And these big decisions really make a massive difference. Like, yeah, everyone's playing Rafine, everyone's playing Dennick, everyone's playing Bat, everyone's playing Mastermind, but there are little decisions this deck has to make, all the way up to like a play set of cards the other deck doesn't play, right? And a 3 of cards the other deck doesn't play. Like, those are huge, huge adjustments, and they all matter tremendously. So no Tidebinders in the main deck, but there are 3 in the sideboard for what that's worth, and it's worth a lot. Destroy Evil in this matchup, mostly against, I believe, the Domain matchup, but also tons of other stuff, right? Long Goodbye against creature lands and stuff, Lord of the Third Path, a bunch of stuff that you would expect. So just a really, really fantastic build of Esper by who I think is one of the best Magic players in the world right now, and probably the Esper understander if you had to pick one, so keep that in mind. But moving on to the only Boros Convoke player in the entire top 16, is that a correct statement? I don't want to be incorrect. Yeah, that's the only Boros deck in the whole top 16. Brave Takumi Matsura with Boros Convoke over here. And let's see how we built this deck. The way you build this deck. Now, again, this deck takes some hits for being a little bit too samey, but it is not built the same way every time. There are some decisions. The big one here being the 2 Sanguine Evangelists that you'll often see 4 copies of, and the 1 Yoshin Frontliner that you really see range from 0 to 3 copies of. But I do like a copy of Frontliner in this deck. I always have. But we all know this deck by now. I would say. I think the big, innovations here for an event like the Pro Tour, how are we going to approach the matchups that we expect to see? And the way we do that is through our sideboard. So how did we do that? We've got Invasion of Gobakhan in here, makes plenty of sense against everything you expect to see. Fantastic against Control and Esper, obviously. And even in the odd, mid-range matchups like Ogari and stuff, this is a wonderful card. So really, really like that. Also decent in some ways against the Rage decks, I want to point out, but not incredible. But it can take the sweeper away from them. It can take the Rage away from them in the early game, and it's really hard for them to do anything about this. So keep that in mind. Urbrass Forge for long games, mostly blue-white control in mind with this one. In the festivities against the Mirror, mostly. Destroy Evil against Domain Ramp and, Azorius Artifacts and a bunch of other stuff. Just good card to have in your pocket. Kills Atraxas and stuff while also killing Leyline Binding, right? Destroys the Virtue in green, so it's kind of important. Lithomantic Barrage, again, mirror matches are important and then get lost. Mostly against, aggro and decks that deign to play Planeswalkers, which probably the least played card type over the weekend was Planeswalkers. So that's an interesting meta. But yeah, this is just kind of vanilla Boros. This is what we've come to expect, but that is not a knock. This deck is kind of a best of one deck that is very consistent and plays a lot of 4-ofs and knows exactly what it's trying to do and wants to consistently enact that plan as often as possible, the way Boros decks, or just aggro decks in general, do. So, you want to have the same turn 1, 2, 3, 4 in most games. So you play a ton of 4-ofs and you play basically the best card you can play on every turn. I don't really have to tell you too much about this. Aldiran Epicure, Resolute Reinforcements, Knight Arrow to Vios, for card draw. Imidane's Recruiter for the big win. Warden of Inner Sky to have a creature that scales super well throughout the game, gives you something to do with all your little dinky artifact tokens and stupid creatures that can't attack. Novice Inspector to give you card draw and also fuel the Warden. Sanguine Evangelist to make all your creatures huge and also keep your board position right. Yoshin Frontliner to be a nice little dude. He's a good little dude. Gaze of the Gateway Express is the best removal spell in the deck. Basically the only real removal spell in the deck. War Leader's Call is, an anthem effect and also a way to bone them with the Gleeful Demolition. Just like bolt them. That's kind of nice. And the Gleeful Demolition, obviously, to mostly take advantage of Knight Errant of Eos and Imidane's Recruiter, which are the two real main cards in the deck. So, in case you needed a quick rundown of Boros for whatever reason, there it was. But there is precisely one real aggro deck in Best of 3 Standard. It is this deck. And honestly, after this tournament, even though it did end up in, the top 3, technically, I still think that Boros will take a bit of a hit in the popularity department in Best of 3, continue to do that in Best of 3, but probably still remain very, very strong in Best of 1. But let's get on to the top 2 decks of the day. Yuta Takahashi with Azorius Control. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a just really good version of this deck, by the way, by, again, perennial celebrated Pro Tour competitor here. And one of the best players, maybe ever. I hesitate to say, but not really, because we're getting there with Yuta. Some of the play we saw on camera by Yuta over the weekend is some of the best Magic play you'll ever see in your life. And that's coming from a guy who's had plenty of bad things to say about like blue-white control in the past. I'm sort of halfway known for that, right? But despite the fact that I don't think threat assessment is as big of a deal as it seems, there were plenty of lines and sequences where Yuta was obviously at the very, very tip top of his or anybody else's game when sort of planning out turn-by-turn lines with this thing. So just hats off. It was a very difficult tournament to force blue-white into, but 2 players pulled it off, and one of them made the finals, so good job, Yuta. But all 4 copies of the Wandering Emperor in this thing, 2 temporary lockdown. Remember, this is not best of 1. We've got 3 copies of Sunfall. Remember, this is not best of 1. We've got 3 steps ahead, basically like one of the new cards from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. We saw this do a tons of work over the weekend in various different control piles, but obviously just a beautiful hard counter with tons and tons of upside. So yes, you play this in control. 4 white marches in here, just a really, really cool card. I was able to take out any number of like problem permanent types. And also exiles. I kind of can't wait for this card to rotate just a little bit, especially along with the Wandering Emperor. We got to get rid of Control's ability to exile everything. But while they have that ability, these cards are very, very good. Also really good against creature lands. I want to throw that out here. One of the deck's sort of weaknesses is creature lands, and March is very good against those. Memory Deluge, obviously, all 4 copies of this. No More Lies, all 4 copies of this. These are kind of no-brainers. 3 Deduce, this is the deck's, one of their new favorite ways of drawing cards since MKM came out, at least. It's basically 2 cards, and that's great for 2 upfront mana, right? Phantom Interference is a brand new card from Outlaws, and basically the only new one in like the main deck. But yeah, cool. Obviously good play here, right? It's kind of like to make disappear, but you can leverage it a little bit more by, creating a token instead, or also creating a token if you have enough mana, which is always kind of busted, right? So that's kind of nice, but there's also a make disappear in here because we have Wandering Emperors and other ways of like making tokens like Sunfall or whatever. So sometimes the casualty will come up in the later game. It's a better card than a card like Interference for actually countering spells. And then a copy of Get Lost in here just as a catch-all for problem permanents, right? 28 cards as far as lands are concerned. 1 copy of Aganjo, 1 copy of Atara, 2 copies of Mirex for making dudes, and then 4 Restless Anchorage, more or less inarguably the most important land in the entire deck because it's the kind of the creature that's going to win us the most games. But honestly, the way Control wins games is by simply making sure the opponent can't win the game. You see a lot of handshakes seemingly out of nowhere if you don't know what's going on when you're watching blue-white Control play. But obviously if you do know what's going on, those handshakes make perfect sense, because as soon as the other player is completely deprived of resources, has no cards left in hand, and the blue-white control player has, 4 cards in hand and plenty of other resources on the table to draw from, the game is more or less over almost no matter what the life totals are. So you almost don't have to have a win condition some of the time in control, but the slow grind of a Restless Anchorage and a Wandering Emperor bearing down on you is enough to win most games. But you can bring a Broombringer Valkyrie in from the sideboard if you want to, if you just want like a big fat creature. And same thing goes with Hullbreaker Horror, which made an appearance in the finals matchup. And should have been an amazing play, but actually just locked Utah out of having enough mana to do anything about a Leyline Binding. So really, really cool to see this card come down for the first time in a long time on camera, in the finals of the Pro Tour. But still, that was kind of the beginning of the end of the last game of the tournament when this card did resolve. But still, good to have, especially in a deck with 3 steps ahead, where the potential to copy, counter a spell and copy a Hullbreaker Horror at the same time with a 3 steps ahead is horrifying. It's a terrifying possibility. But as far as the rest of the cards in the sideboard, 3 Negate, 3 Tidebinder can come in from the board, 2 Destroy Evil, 2 more Temporary Lockdown for the full play set, and then 2 Unlicensed Hearse to deal with graveyard decks, and a Filigree Silex. Very interesting. Instead of like the 4 Sunfall, we're going to go even lower with our sweeper here and play like, a great sweeper against Boros, because sometimes just to take out all their tokens, it's just 2 mana. To take out all their 1-drops, it's 2 mana and a turn, which you can often do if you get this down on turn 2. So just really interesting sort of sideboard construction here, and mostly the difference was play. Utah played this deck like a madman over the weekend, just genius level play from Utah on camera, and I can only imagine off as well. So with that in mind, though, let's look at the top deck of the tournament, Domain Ramp by your champion, Yoshihiko Ikawa. Now, Domain versus Blue-White Control is a classic and more or less 50-50 kind of matchup. One could argue that Cavern of Souls gives a deck like Domain just that slight edge, and it did help greatly in the finals, as a matter of fact, again, bringing that matchup up. But honestly, in reality, this matchup is closer to 50-50 than I think a lot of people gave it credit for, and it was a great matchup, too. If you haven't seen the finals, absolutely beautiful play again on both ends from both competitors. Note that Domain Ramp only put 1 deck in the entire top 16, but again, due to perfect level, just God level play from the pilot, Ikawa in this case, we were able to get all the way to first place with Domain Ramp, even though it didn't, do a bang-up job of the rest of the tournament. And I think that it maybe should have, to be honest. It's no surprise this deck came in first in a lot of ways, because it can sort of prey on, I don't want to use the word prey on. I don't, because it's not a lopsided matchup. Again, just like the Blue-White Control versus Domain matchup is a little closer than I think some people give it credit for. So is the Esper and Domain matchup. But Domain tends to have what most people would consider a favorable matchup against Esper. So again, no surprise that a deck went, through a field, just plowed through a field of Esper. A deck like Domain did that. And got all the way to the top podium here. So again, congratulations to Ikawa. How did we build the deck here? How did Ikawa build the deck? Let's give them all the credit, right? Archangel of Wrath, 4 of. Topiary Stomper, 4 of. 3 Atraxa, 1 Imidane's Recruiter. So nothing that we haven't seen before, unless you've been sort of under a rock for the last few weeks. Imidane's Recruiter might look weird to some people. This is the newest sort of technological innovation in the deck. And it's a really cool one, because if you heard Migration, that's a lot of power and toughness on the board, but usually you have to pass turn before you can do anything with it, but not with an Imidane's Recruiter. You can Herd Migration, Imidane's Recruiter, finish the game out of nowhere on that turn, and that can actually be really valuable against, decks like Control and decks like Esper that you really don't want to give a turn to untap, both because they can kill all your guys or they can kill you. So, in the case of Esper, so you really got to close those doors when you can, and Imidane's Recruiter gives you a shot at doing that. It's also 4 Leyline Binding, as you would expect, 3 Up the Beanstalk in the main, 2 Spelunking in the main, 4 Herd Migration, you would expect it, 3 Sunfall, this is not best of 1, but yeah, 3 Depopulate, so it kind of is best of 1, a Glimpse the Core, and a Cartographer's Survey. Maybe the most interesting tech in this deck, because it's not 4 copies or 3 copies or whatever of Invasion of Zendikar, which is what you'd normally see in these slots and beyond. Again, normally it's at least 3 copies of Invasion of Zendikar in these slots. Instead, only 2 slots are dedicated to this kind of ramp, and they're very different cards than we normally see. So, really interesting. The deck plays 3 forests in total. So that's what it's going to get with Glimpse the Core. That's why it's only got the 1 Glimpse the Core. But it needs another turn 2 play, and sometimes this will also help it, ramp to the Atraxa without having to draw the land, right? So that's important. Cartographer's Survey is 4 mana for a sorcery to look at the top 7 cards of your library. Put up to 2 lands from among them on the battlefield. Tap, the rest go on the bottom in a random order. Interesting to play this over a card like Invasion, right? But this just gets lands. So it's not restricted to basics the way a card like Invasion is. So you can theoretically play fewer basics in your deck, and I just really like the idea of that, all things considered. Also allows you to sort of re-add the black removal to the deck that the deck took out a couple of months ago when it added Cavern of Souls. But if you play Cartographer's Survey, then you've got, your Rafine's Towers and your Zyator's Proving Grounds in the deck, plus your, 1 Swamp or whatever in this case. So you are more likely with the Cartographer's Survey to actually get the black mana that you need or whatever, even though you took all that black mana out. You can still get a Proving Ground off of it and get the black mana that you need for a card like Long Goodbye, which is a very, very important card in this deck. The deck otherwise just gets completely beat up by creature lands. Notably, Restless Anchorage makes the blue-white matchup, whether it's Esper or blue-white control, makes that matchup much, much better for the blue-white decks. So carrying 1 Long Goodbye at the very least, and you'll note 3 in the sideboard here, just complete. This is for Restless Anchorage because it is the problem card in the Azorius and blue-white control matchups. So having, a removal spell that can't be countered, the spell can't be countered. It was very close to being countered. I believe, was it Arna? Was it? No, I think it was actually the finals match. I'm trying to remember which match it was, but actually I think it was Arna Hushenbeth was very close to trying to negate a Long Goodbye. He stuck it out there and went, well, never mind. So, I think it was Arna, but either way. Really, really interesting pick for a sideboard 3 of here, because you have got to kill Restless Anchorage. I know I've been on the card for a second here, but I can't stress enough how important and good and cool this addition to the deck is. Just Cartographer's Survey makes that a little bit more possible. But it's not all Survey, just the fact that Long Goodbye is a 3 up in the sideboard at all. Massive concession against Anchorage, which is the card that will kill this deck more than any other card. So there's your concession for it. Just love it. That's a key reason this deck got in the first place, in my opinion at least. But it's just cool to see Domain Ramp on top for one last time, I think, here in Standard. Always been a great deck, will continue being a great deck, has been on the downswing these last couple of months, really, since MKM came out. This deck has been on the downswing, but in a tournament dominated by Esper, in a tournament with a lot of blue-white control matchups, right? In a tournament with a lot of mid-range matchups in general. A deck like this can get it done, especially if it makes those necessary concessions to decks like Esper. Again, that Long Goodbye, man. This is maybe, I'm telling you, it's so unassuming, but this 3 of Long Goodbye on the sideboard is maybe the most important decision that, Ikawa made when building this deck. So, really, really good stuff. Again, congratulations, Ikawa. You deserve it. And so do all these other top 8 and top 16 and top whatever competitors. Everyone did a great job this weekend. Again, from the players down to the production staff. Did a wonderful job. It was maybe the best Pro Tour I've watched in a really, really, really long time. And I'm really looking forward to the World Championships now, which will be late October sometime after Duskmorn comes out. But that will be a standard tournament for Worlds right at the end of the year. Super, super hype after rotation too. Let's go. It's going to be a good time, but honestly, I'm just happy to look forward to standard tournaments again. I look forward to this one. And again, it exceeded my expectations. I already said that on Twitter, but really, I sat down with my popcorn and my Slim Jims. I didn't really have any of that stuff, but I sat down with my coffee, mostly, and watched a lot of what was on camera at this Pro Tour over the weekend. And it was super entertaining. Good to see standard paper Magic in the spotlight again. And honestly, you know, the weekend didn't have to be as good as it was. It could have just been lame, boring, standard paper Magic. You know, 30% of the field's Esper. No. But no, we had some breakout decks here. We had some decks that were already on the cusp really start to trend, you know, like Temur, Analyst, and 4-color Legends. And altogether, a great weekend of Magic play, especially when it comes to the quality of the play. Absolutely masterful. So that's all I've really got for this one. I know this was a very, very long video. I apologize for that, but there's so much happened. There was so much to talk about and so many sort of exciting story threads to follow in this one. So if you made it all the way to the end, congrats to you as well, just as much as Ikawa. What a grind you made it through to get to this point in the video. But anyway, that's about all for this one. Just do all the YouTube stuff on your way out, right? Like the video if you enjoyed it and you want to see more stuff like this. I really want to cover some of these decks a little bit more in depth on the channel. So again, sub to the sandwich if you're interested in seeing more stuff, and then check out the Patreon, $1 a month to vote on content and just really help out the channel to this massive degree that you couldn't possibly comprehend. Seriously, $1 a month moves mountains around here. So hit the link to Patreon, the description if you haven't done it yet. It supports me like crazy. But anyway, that's all I got for this one, guys. That is Allski Kowalski. Let me know how you felt about the Pro Tour for the Cowboy set down there in the comments section. And I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.